Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dana Boyd, Senior Researcher at Microsoft Research, New England.
Good afternoon. Thank you so much for coming out today. Let me put this back here for a second. Girl clothing, microphones, always a bad combination. I want to talk with you today about some of my work on privacy. I've been looking at how young people think about and understand privacy for quite some time. For those who aren't familiar with my work, I'm an ethnographer. I spend most of my time running around the United States looking at how young people understand social media as a part of their everyday life. And so my goal today is to talk about privacy in light of young people in order to think more generally about the implications that this has for both companies and governments. Now, if we think about young people, we've seen a lot of different kind of social media disruptions in recent years, but what is it about? How do we understand it? I think the most important thing to realize is that young people use social media as a part of their everyday life to hang out with the people that they care about. And they do so in an environment where they go to the site, which is absolutely common amongst their peers. So if they're in a school where MySpace is the dominant paradigm, they're on MySpace. These days, it's all about Facebook. Increasingly, we see new iterations of new technologies, Twitter, Tumblr, Pinterest popping out. And what we see from young people's participation is that it's really driven by where all of their friends are. Now, a lot of people look at young people's participation in these social media and say, why are they spending so much time there? And indeed, you can look at the kinds of conversations that may take place, and they seem to basically boil down to, yo, what's up? How are you? Good. What you doing? Nothing. And it's this kind of back and forth conversation. So how do we actually think about that? We can think of it as a form of social grooming. It's really equivalent to the idea of saying, I like you, we're friends, yes we are, back and forth and back and forth. And these kind of dynamics are really the gel that makes social media so powerful. When we see young people participating on these sites, they talk about it in terms of hanging out. They talk about it as a space where they can go and be with their friends, joke around, laugh, and sort of be a part of everyday culture with the people that they know. Now, it's also a way in which this material becomes documented. It becomes part of a long, ongoing kind of public. And this is actually where the questions of publicness get complicated. So one of the things that I would argue is that what young people are doing is that they're participating in a type of networked public. Now, publics are the kinds of spaces that you gather whenever you're hanging out and you want to actually be a part of something as a collective. You will gather in physical public spaces, places like parks, places like the mall for some of you who are growing up. Well, for young people, their participation in publics is very much about a networked culture, a networked environment. And yet, the kinds of publics that they participate in are very different than the publics that we understand traditionally. And this is where a lot of the complications arise, especially when we care about issues like privacy. So I want to go through 4 key affordances of these kinds of networked publics and talk about 3 different dynamics in order to ground this conversation so that we can go into a broader conversation about privacy. The first key affordance to keep in mind has to do with persistence. What young people say online sticks around for a very long time. That means that the embarrassing things that they wrote when they were teenagers are still on the internet. And I say this as somebody who grew up online and is amazed that Usenet is still around. Has nice little records of the embarrassing things that I did. Asynchronicity is a really powerful tool for actually having conversations, but it's also really challenging when the kinds of content that you provide in an online environment stick around. Another key affordance that young people have to navigate has to do with replicability. Again, the architecture of the internet makes it such that it's very easy to take bits and share them, and in that sharing, that process involves a lot of replication. Well, it's very hard also to determine what was the original bit and what was the duplicate. And this process of replicability is something that young people have to struggle with when they see information flowing. How do you know what the original was versus something that was modified? This is actually one of the challenges for young people when you're not quite sure who said what as information spreads and gossip spreads. Another key affordance to keep in mind has to do with searchability. My mother would have loved the ability to stand in a room and just sort of scream find, like a Harry Potter movie, and figure out where I was off in the ether. She couldn't, for which I am deeply, deeply grateful. But for a lot of young people today, they're extraordinarily searchable. Right? All it takes is somebody who's curious to know what they're about, a college admissions officer, for example, to search for them. Yet, it's not just that young people are searchable. They're not searchable by just anyone. They're searchable by those who hold power over them. These are parents, these are teachers, these are people who want to market to them, these are people who want to maybe accept them for a job, and it becomes this challenge of searchability that they have to navigate as they put content up online. Finally, the fourth key affordance to really keep in mind has to do with scalability. Now, if you put something out online, and any of you who've ever done any marketing know, it may be in theory able to reach a billion plus people, but in reality, not that many people visit your website. Right? And a couple years back when blogging was sort of at its peak, a site called Steganography decided to look at how frequently blogs were read and found that the average, and I do mean average as in mean, the average blog was read by 6 people. And if you think about that and you think about sites like Boing Boing, you realize that the vast majority of blogs are read by no one. And so this becomes a really interesting trick online, is that just because something can scale to millions and millions of people doesn't mean it will. And young people quickly learn that that which scales, that which spreads, tends to be that which is most embarrassing, humiliating, grotesque, or sexual. In fact, the things they least want to spread. Right? And that's where we have these interesting challenges around scale. It's how do you deal with an environment where you're not quite sure what's going to scale, and it's inevitably the things you least want to scale. Now let's think about this in some of the dynamics that sort of underpin what's going on here. First, there's the issue of invisible audiences. Here we are sitting at Microsoft in Redmond, and I have a sense of you as an audience. You're here on the public day of TechFest. You're coming because you're curious what's happening at Microsoft Research, and I'm speaking to you in an environment where I think you at least have some interest in what I'm saying. But at the other end of that room, there's also a camera pointed at me, and I have no idea who is behind that camera. I have no idea if anything I'm saying makes sense. I don't know if they're listening to this in 2012 or 2015. I don't know if they've even heard of these terms. I don't know if what I'm saying has been chopped up and modified. Right? That's an invisible audience. And one of the challenges in an online environment is that young people have to navigate invisible audiences every day as a process of participation. The result of which is that, by and large, they try to imagine who their audience is. And it's not just young people doing this. This is adults as well. You have a vision of who you think the audience should be. And in fact, that's actually one of the things about the friends list. The friends list on social media is in many ways an articulation of who you want the audience to be, who you imagine it to be, and who you think you're speaking to. But how do you navigate all of these invisible audiences? Many adults, they like to play ostrich, pretend like those audiences don't exist. Young people are hoping that the invisible audiences might actually pay attention to them in a positive way, but it's always a challenge. Another key dynamic that plays out around this has to do with collapsed contexts. Again, in this room right now, we have an understanding that this is a lecture. And as a lecturer, you're supposed to sit there and pretend like you're paying attention and nod and smile and look engaged. Right? That's the rules we've set up for this room. Now, of course, any one of you could get up and start dancing on the table right now. I would find it personally very entertaining, but it would completely violate the idea of what this context is. And that doesn't mean that when you're, not out tonight drinking with your friends, you might indeed get up and start dancing and it'd be fun. Part of it is, how do you understand what a given context is? And a context is really driven by your understanding of the space, the environment of what's going on, what the rules and norms are for that space, but also for the people, how you relate to particular people. What happens online is that the context that you're used to navigating as discrete contexts collide in unexpected ways. And this is one of the challenges for, as we think about privacy, as we think about these issues of publicity, that context collision is a really hard thing to navigate. Third key dynamic that we have to keep in mind as we think about privacy has to do with the blurring of what we normally think of as public and private spaces. Again, we have an understanding that certain spaces are more or less public. The home is relatively private, although anybody who has children knows it's not as private as you want it to be. We have certain ideas of certain spaces being very public, say, for example, the park. And yet, at times, we say very private things in very public places, and vice versa. In an online environment, those boundaries get a lot more blurred. And it's that blurring where we start to see privacy getting contested and confused. So with this as a backdrop, I want to sort of dive into some of the ways in which young people think about and deal with privacy. First, I want to start with this great quote, which is now a couple of years old, but I still think it's so poignant. It's from a young woman named Blys, and she says, "My mom always uses the excuse about the internet being public when she defends herself," and Blys referring to her mother's looking at her online journals of the time. And she's like, "It's not like I do anything to be ashamed of, but a girl needs her privacy." Right? And here we have one of the biggest conflicts about how young people are struggling to deal with privacy in an online environment. On one hand, she knows that her content is completely publicly accessible. Anybody could look at it. But she has this expectation that her mother is not supposed to be looking at it. That privacy isn't about whether or not her content is accessible, but what the norms are that govern that access and that understanding. And here's where we do have to think through how young people deal with privacy. It's not about hiding. It's not about excluding oneself from being part of something. Instead, it's actually about the ability to have some sense of control. But it's not control over data, which is normally how we talk about privacy. Instead, it's a two-part process. One is the ability to have agency, the ability to actually have some sense of power within a situation. And the second is to understand the social situation enough to together be able to actually exert some control over that situation. And that combination, the ability to have agency and the ability to understand and interpret the rules of the situation, are extraordinarily hard in an online environment. And they're hard for really complex reasons. First off, young people often have their agency usurped by adults. Parents who look over their shoulders, for example. They also have, their understanding of a social situation undermined by shifting natures of these technologies, where all of a sudden the privacy settings change, where all of a sudden new people are on the environment and they're trying to deal with it. So they're struggling to exert some form of control that makes sense of them. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not trying to participate in these public spaces. And it's actually their participation in these public settings where you start to see the sort of fractures that become important. So I want to give you an example from a woman named Alicia, who Alice Marwick and I actually went down and interviewed. And I think that she highlights something very important here because she talks about some of the shifts and her struggles with it. She says, "I just think that technology is redefining what's acceptable for people to put out about themselves. I've grown up with technology, so I don't know how it was before this boom of social networking. But it seems like instead of spending all of our time talking to other individual people and sharing things that would seem private, we spend our time putting it up in one module of communication where people can go and access it if they want to." Right? Now, what she's highlighting is a shift that has happened, a shift because of the technical affordances, and she doesn't even realize the importance of that shift. But I want to sort of play it out for you. If we were having a conversation, say in the hallway, our interaction would be, in many ways, private by default, public with effort. It would be private by default just because the conversation could only be overheard so far. It would be public by effort because if you wanted to share what we talked about, you would have to go out of your way to publicize it. It would take these steps to publicize it. And so we make a decision then about what to publicize. Yet in an online environment, these things swap. This goes to the absolute opposite direction. That participation in social media is in many ways public by default, private through effort. Our interactions online, it's easier to put them up and make them broadly accessible and then choose what to exclude. And indeed, that's what we see young people doing on a regular basis. That they actually choose what to exclude from public discourse as opposed to what to include. And that shift is really, really confusing to people because if you're not prepared for it, you sit there and say, "Why are you sharing your breakfast? I don't want to know about your breakfast." When the inverse attitude is, "There's nothing wrong with sharing my breakfast. I might as well share it, and if you don't like it, you'll move on." Right? And that's a really radical shift in terms of navigating these issues. Part of it has to do with the fact that young people are not trying to be public. They're not trying to be seen by everybody across all space and all time, but rather they're trying to find a public that they can participate in. And this is really important in light especially of an American context where young people have few opportunities to engage with their peers in an unstructured setting, a place where they can just hang out. And those spaces, those publics, become extraordinarily important to them. So they look to social media as an attempt to find a public that they can participate in. But it doesn't mean that they're trying to be public. And that's an important distinction. Now, as they're participating in those publics, though, they don't understand why other people don't understand the rules of those publics. Why adults don't see that this is not a space for them. And inevitably, there are constant complaints about teachers or parents. What are they doing looking at this material? They don't belong there. And this is where we start to see young people trying to develop strategies. And so I want to highlight are the kinds of, a few examples of strategies that young people take to achieve privacy. Many of these have parallels in an offline setting, but I'm going to talk about them in an online setting because I think that they're important. Now, I'm going to begin with a young person by the name of Hunter. And Hunter is a young man living in D.C., and he's dealing with very strong context collapses in his world. He is going to a public charter school that's really for really intelligent, highly academic young people. He's really excited about his school. He likes being a part of this geeky environment. But he also comes from a working class environment that is very different. He likes to talk about it, and particularly talk about his sister as quote-unquote ghetto. And so one of the things he's dealing with on Facebook is that he has to deal with these conflicting worlds about how he has simultaneously interactions with his friends and his peers and with his sister. And so what he says here is, when I'm talking to my friends on Facebook or I put up a status, something I hate is when people who I'm not addressing my statuses comment on them. In my old school, people used to always call me nerdy and that I was the least black person they've ever met. Some would say that on Facebook, and I'd say, should I take offense to the fact that someone put the ringtone white and nerdy is for me? And it was a joke. I guess we were all talking about it, and my sister comes out of nowhere and she's like, oh, baby bro. And I'm like, no, don't say that. I wasn't talking to you. Right, so asking Hunter about this is like, how are you supposed to navigate this? And he's like, well, it's just, I think there are certain ways you talk. He was pointing out he would talk to his sister differently than he would talk to his friends. And he really thought his sister should know this. And he constantly struggled because no amount of asserting of the social norms meant that his sister got it. So instead, he started actually developing technical means to keep people out. Hunter and his friends at school were really interested in old, classic video games and other material, which, by the way, again, it pains me, where his notion of classic video games was The Legends of Zelda, which makes me feel sufficiently old. But he was talking about how he loved to geek out on Legends of Zelda and about Pokemon. But if he would write about these things on Facebook, his cousins and his sister would make fun of him because what was cool within that group was much more in the world of shooter video games. And so he got to a point where he decided that anytime he would talk about Pokemon or Legends of Zelda, he would go out of his way to block people. And he would make a special list just to talk about these things. Not because he was trying to hide his interest in Zelda, but he didn't want to deal with the context collisions. He didn't want to deal with the awkward dynamics between different people. This is one of the strategies for achieving privacy. It's a very technical strategy, but it's also one of the things that's really hard to do, and so young people are dealing with that. And the next two strategies I'm going to give you are very technical strategies, and they're very unique to the two young women that I'm going to talk about, but they're important to highlight the kinds of extremes that young people will go to. The first has to do with a young woman by the name of Shamika that we met in D.C. And Shamika was constantly dealing with drama in her school. And she was frustrated because people would go back way into Facebook and take things from, a long time ago, as in like a month or 2 months ago, and they would bring it back to the forefront and they would turn it into a big deal. So she got to a point where when she would log into Facebook, she would read a comment that was left to her, and then she would delete it. And she would go and she would leave comments on other people's sites or on other people's pages. She would mark things up. And then the next day she would go and she would delete the messages she left. And she talked about it in terms of basically keeping Facebook perfectly clean, perfectly empty. There was no long-term or persistent record of Facebook. Right? And it didn't mean that she didn't think that it could be recorded. In fact, one of the things I asked her is that, well, Facebook has a copy of this where your friends can copy it. And she's just like, yeah, but if you go to that much effort, you're really creepy. Right? And so it was a recognition that this was a way of signaling to her peers that pulling this stuff from the past was not appropriate. Michaela, who's also from D.C., was dealing with a different set of dynamics. She is dealing with the fact that she's under state supervision. She's in foster care. She's dealing with different dynamics in terms of adults looking in on her life on a regular basis. And she knew that they were looking for online records of what she was doing. So when Facebook put together a feature when Facebook decided that it didn't want people to delete their accounts, what it gave them was an option where if you go to try to delete your account, it would say, really, you don't want to do that. Just deactivate it, and if you feel like coming back, everything will be there for you. Well, Michaela took that to an extreme. So what would happen is that every day, at the end of her use of Facebook, she would deactivate her account. That would render her entirely invisible in the system. It would mean nobody could message her. It would mean that nobody could see her profile. And then the next day, when she would log back in, she would reactivate her account. And her account was basically invisible at all points except during the moments in which she was logged in. Right? She made it a real-time activity. Pretty powerful way of going about this. And when I was asking her about, why, how does this play out? She's like, well, no adult looks at this at night. Right? Which is, again, this sort of way of trying to understand the circumstances and exacting some sort of control over it. Now, these are extreme approaches, but I want to talk about a sort of more common approach. Carmen was a young woman that we met in Massachusetts, and Carmen really loved her mother. They were super, super close. She was super excited to have her mother on Facebook with her. There was all sorts of good dialogues, but she couldn't stand when her mother would sort of overreact to things. And her mother had this tendency to want to comment on everything. And as Carmen points out, is a little overwhelming because everybody disappears after the mom post, right? So when mom comments, no one responds. Well, the other thing about Carmen's mom is that Carmen's mom tends to overreact to what Carmen says, especially emotional things. And so Carmen's always trying to find a way to convey emotions to her friends without them overreacting. Or without her mom overreacting. One day, Carmen and her boyfriend break up, and she's having a pretty crappy day. And she wants to explain this to her friends. She wants to sort of gather some sort of support. And so she thinks about, expressing herself. And as a teenager, expressing herself and her emotions means putting up song lyrics. But she knew if she put up any sort of sappy song lyric that her mother would go, crazy and would think she was suicidal. So she decided to do something which she knew would not be visible to her mother, but would be to her friends. She decided to put up song lyrics from Always Look on the Bright Side of Life. Now, for those who don't get the Monty Python reference, this is a very chipper and happy song, Always Look on the Bright Side of Life, sung during a part of the movie where the key character is about to be executed. It is not a happy scene. And she knew that her friends had just recently seen this movie. She knew that it was outside of the cultural purview of her mother. And so she puts up these song lyrics. Her mother immediately comments, "Oh, it looks like you're having a great day." And her friends immediately call her. Right? And this is a really powerful tactic for achieving privacy in a public environment. It's something that in many ways we've understood, especially in the computer science world, as steganography. It's a cryptographic notion of hiding in plain sight. And what Carmen is doing is a form of social steganography. She is making it possible to convey a really detailed message while hiding in plain sight. Now, I've been talking to young people for the better part of a decade, and one of the things that I find really startling over the decade that I've been looking at social media is how I increasingly cannot tell what they're talking about on social media. And it's not because I don't understand the cultural references. I watch way too much teen TV, I know way too much about teen music, but it's the fact that I am actually not located within their peer group. I don't know their in-jokes. And most of what they're starting to do in social media is put up a whole set of encoded information. They're conveying a lot of detailed private information, but I can't make sense of it. And what we see is that young people have found that the most reasonable tactic for achieving privacy in a networked public environment is to make the content itself perfectly accessible, but make certain that the meaning is not at all accessible. And that is extremely powerful. It's not just young people that are doing this. We're starting to see this as adults and a whole group of people. It's also not entirely new. And one of the things that I find interesting talking to activists in particular is how this was a tactic of oppressed populations forever. Right? And so, again, what do we think about teenagers as an oppressed population? Something to sort of leave and ponder with. So I want to sort of roll this forward. And what does this mean as we start to go forward? Many of you in the room are interested in all sorts of different notions of privacy. Issues of data privacy, issues of how to deal with the complex big data problems that we're starting to see. And most of what I've just been talking about is what I would call social privacy. I think it's important to recognize that there are all of these conflicting issues with privacy that are coming up and emerging. Young people in many ways are paying no attention to what companies or what governments are doing. They don't know how to make sense of it. It's not within a cultural frame. Of course, there's a lot of great scholarly data that shows that adults also have no clue what's happening with companies or governments either. So it's not that young people are especially clueless. It's pretty much that everyone has no clue what's going on.